wonder if you could just stand up on the stage up here. If you could just walk back to that table. Thank you. Paul was not prepared for this, by the way. I distracted him from an email. Could you just walk backwards with that, please? Just keep walking, or just be prepared for the edge of the stage, please. Yeah. Okay, we'll keep going. There we go. Keep going back. Keep going. There we go. So neither of us have fallen off the stage. Does anyone know what this is? This is the Wall Street Journal's homepage, as displayed on an iPhone at 1:1 scale. Okay, so that's how much space we scroll through in the physical world when we go from the top of that page to the bottom of the page. I can see some of you are taking photographs, so I'll just wait. There we go. So thank you very much, Paul, for being my able assistant in showing that to people. And that's really where I'd like to start. That page is the height of an African bull elephant, from top to bottom. And for me, it really encapsulates what we've come to call responsive web design. We create this one page that has to work on every single device, and we've got this one-size-fits-all mentality. And what that means is we end up creating experiences that actually cater for the lowest common denominator. They're complex, and they result in a kind of mediocre experience depending on the device that they're displayed on. And ultimately that leads to lost revenue. And the reasons behind some of this we've touched on. Some of the solutions to this we've already talked about. I'm going to go into a little bit of the history and how some of these things manifest themselves. So you have two dimensions of navigation on a mobile screen, as anyone who's used Tinder will tell you. I'm obviously going on what I've been told rather than my own personal experiences, but I understand you can go left and right and not just up and down. I see that myself in other mobile experiences, such as this is Windows Phone, for example, where they make extensive use of both axes of navigation. So this is just one area to do with the difference in devices and how people interact with them, which I would challenge. Yeah, we could spend the entire afternoon going through all the different aspects of user interface and user experience and how by catering for the different attributes of a device, we can improve the user experience. But I hope this is just sort of one of them that can sort of get you thinking, and we can talk a little bit later. I also touched on complexity. So this is sort of going back to GCSE maths, or O-level maths for some of us. So if you have 5 components in a system, then there are 10 interconnections between those different components. And as you add another component, you jump up to 15 interconnections. So it doesn't matter what the system is, the more things you have relating to one another and talking to each other or needing to communicate with each other, then the more complex those interconnections become. For the mathematicians among you, that's the formula to work out the number of interconnections for the number of components. I'm sure it'll be on a GCSE paper soon. So this is sort of fundamental to do with computing. It's not just to do with web or revenue or these sorts of things. But Douglas Crockford really sort of summed this up for me. He's one of the leading proponents of JavaScript. He said the web is the most hostile software engineering environment imaginable. Yeah? And that really is because, if we go back, there are just so many interconnecting parts. And some of them we don't even control. We don't have any control over them, the network, the browser, these kinds of things. It's very unknown. So those of us, or those people who sort of have dealt with non-web technologies, it's really simple. You know who makes the database, you know who makes the front end, you know what operating system you're running on, it's very simple. This is very hard. And what that means in the web is that as the sort of complexity is increasing, so does the cost. And that cost very often manifests itself in terms of people. So the more complex something becomes, the more skills you need. You need your user experience person, you need your web designer, you need your front end, you need your back end, you need your network. all those things you need today in order to create a team that are going to deliver the really best kind of user experience you want to create the most profitable websites. And of course those people cost money, they're expensive, so the larger your cost, the less your profit is going to be. Okay, particularly for small and medium-sized businesses. Obviously the blue chip companies have got huge budgets and things like that, but for a lot of us we're not necessarily working on those kind of projects. And all of this is true before we consider the new technologies. So I'm going to place a bet now, and you can all tell me in a year's time if I'm wrong, but I think service workers is going to become the new HTML5. I think this term is going to be used and abused just like HTML5 was. It's going to be widely misunderstood, lots of people are going to talk about it. If you're in the agency business, your clients are going to come and say, I want service workers, yeah? And they're not going to know what it means. Well, you will all know what it means, of course. But they're not necessarily going to know what it means. So what's it going to mean to them? Yeah, this stuff is quite complicated. Yeah, the benefits of getting it right are absolutely there, but it is complicated. And of course, all those ninjas are going to want to rush to get service workers on their CVs. So this is going to be something they're going to be pushing, of course. And then you've got things like HTTP2. Yeah, this is like the how shall I say, the less sexy cousin of service workers, in my mind. It's really fundamental to the way that all our devices communicate, and it's changing. It's a 2, it's not even a kind of 0.2 or something like that. This is a whole 2. Okay, this is going to be huge. And then we've got other things like web payments coming through. Finally, we might have standards for web payments. This is going to change the way our payments interfaces are working. Yeah. So it was complex anyway, and now we're going to overlay this on top. So let's just look at how that complexity can manifest itself. So I analysed a top brand's new responsive web design site. So this was a new site that they'd put together to support some of their products globally. And I'm not going to tell you who they are, but they used a top web content management system, top Gartner Magic Quadrant web content management system, top digital agency, top hosting. They did not spare the money, they did not spare bringing in the intellectual capacity to work on this project. So I'm really pleased that as the sort of last presenter this afternoon, the 2 previous presenters used things like DevTools within Chrome, for example, which is a really cool tool, F12, but I was told definitely I shouldn't talk about that kind of stuff, but if you're a developer or technical nature, press F12, have a look at DevTools. That timeline is amazing, which just shows you how the page is being constructed. And I've just used that just to look at the home page of this new website. Okay, so what I've done now is break down the content that's being loaded and consumed by the web browser when this new responsive web design site is being loaded. And 55% of what's being loaded is JavaScript. Okay, JavaScript is like the program, it's the logic that kind of runs in the background. Yeah. Several of in fact, both previous presenters mentioned that excessive use of JavaScript, whether it's over tagging or whatever it might be, is not a good thing. But over 50% of this new site is made up of JavaScript. 324 kilobytes is made up of images. Okay, that's not too bad. But then 235k of CSS. So CSS is the stuff that controls the layout. That's where all the sort of magic happens, whether things appear underneath each other or they've got rounded borders or the colour and things like that. That's what that's doing for you. And then you have fonts, 89k of fonts. So this must be quite a special website to need some really, really special fonts. And then finally, we have the good old HTML. HTML is the structure of the page, so it's showing where the different components are located, how they're ordered in relation to each other, and a little bit of the important text, like the headline and things like that. So this site has one single JavaScript file that's 3 times larger than all the images. This must be a site that has some major programming need. It must be doing something really special to need that much program. It must have superpowers as a result, because it's got so much JavaScript in it. So this particular website and this particular homepage, its main purpose is to provide 6 links to different benefits of detergents. It doesn't need superpowers. It's just promoting through 6 links benefits of detergents. Now, Alice talked about performance, the need for performance. I'm not going to go over that, but as a result, it was slow. It was slow in this country. Okay? And one of the reasons it's slow, and I think I'm the first presenter to bring up a slide like this, is when your phone is switched off, is sitting in your pocket like it may be now, doing nothing, it's conserving battery. That's the big problem on mobile phones and mobile devices, is conserving battery. So all the radios power down, and when you open it up and you turn on the screen, the light comes on, you can see the screen. When you press something, it's at that point that the radios start to wake up. And they kind of signal and they go, have I got Wi-Fi, have I got 3G, have I got 2G, what can I connect to, am I on LTE? And that can take up to 2 seconds just to establish communication with the radio station. Okay? As network technology improves, that comes down, so the silver bullet sort of for 5G is it's instant, it's just going to come on straight away. Well, anyone with an engineering background will probably realise it's not going to be instant. It might get to the perception of being instant, but it's still not going to be instant. And of course, it's going to be variable because it's radio. When you get the connection to the base station, you can then connect over the internet, and then that gives you about a second to get a response back again. Okay, so on a mobile device, to my mind, whether the figure's half a megabyte or a quarter of a megabyte, there's a very short period of time to be able to push a limited amount of data back again in that first response. Now the great news, of course, is Service Workers is going to help with this, because if you've already got some stuff loaded up, you can display a crossword while it's loading, or do lots of wonderful things. And I think the use cases for that are going to be many and varied over the next few years, and we're only just at the beginning of determining how all of that's going to work. But if you've never had an interaction before, if you're coming as a result of a tweet or something like that, that very first experience is always going to take longer to load, and that's the first impression that you've got to make a good impression of. So you don't want to be pushing lots of video, even pushing lots of stuff into Service Workers and stuff like that on that first interaction, because the main thing is to get a good quality experience. So if you're promoting the benefits of detergent, then you want that to come up first. Now, the good news, of course, is this particular site did really well in mobile-friendly testing. So if your only testing is doing things like this, then it may give a misleading picture. So let's have a look at browsers. Let's just move on and look at browsers for a minute. So Internet Explorer, the bane of the internet. I am actually going to ask for a show of hands. How many people here now test their websites, if you're involved in web testing, on Internet Explorer 8 or below still? Or is that now a thing of the past? You charge extra. You charge extra for doing it? Yeah. Oh.
I had to do it for one client recently.
Because the client asked?
No, because that's what they use.
That's what they use?
Yeah, that's what they look at. So.
Of course, so in order to pass the test internally, you had to do it, even though there may not have been a business reason for doing it.
No business reason.
I love that. It's just wrong for all the reasons that we're talking about today. So that's great. Well, for some of you, and it sounds like everyone, Internet Explorer 8 at least, is not now something that you consider in your sort of standard package. You charge more for it because a customer's asking. And that would be reflected in the numbers. Now, if we look at one of the countries that was being targeted, we've got India. Okay, so this is based on some work we've done with IHS Technologies. IHS Technologies is a big research company. They look at how much tin's coming out of the ground and which factories it's going to, and then what lorries are leaving the factory and which shops the products are ending up in and all this kind of stuff. They track consumer electronics cradle to grave, okay, or pre-cradle, whatever that is. So we've worked with them, and this is just some of the numbers that we've put together around browser usage, and this is looking at India. So we have Chrome Mobile at the top there, but the next one under the Google ones is the UC browser. Yeah. That's on our figures. If you use StatCount, which is perhaps a more, certainly one that a lot of you will be familiar with, UC browser now in India is reporting nearly 60% of usage is coming from the UC browser. Okay, this is a phenomenal change in the browser landscape. And actually, you look at Asia-Pac countries, and you're seeing Opera, particularly Opera Mini, the UC browser, Maxthon. These are ones in India that are becoming or are very popular today. So if I look at the sort of complexity model, it's not just a case of these dots being 4 things, and then there maybe being a permutation where there's a slight difference between mobile and desktop. You've actually got a whole load of other browsers coming in. So it's kind of a bit like whack-a-mole. You get rid of Internet Explorer 8, you've got another one coming along. Now, if you just happen to be in the UK and at the moment, that's not too bad if your customers and your users are only here in the UK. But if they're global and you care about India, then this is something you really need to consider in your browser testing. And that, of course, makes the complexity a lot harder. So for this particular site, I then went in and we used a company called Perfecto Mobile, where you can actually remote control a device in the country. So I used the Reliance network in India with those 3 browsers, and the site was unusable. It didn't work. You could just about, in some cases, get the link to be pressed on. So that's 30% of traffic from our figures, 60% you take stack count where just this site couldn't be used. If we were to go to China, we have a company called Xiaomi, which doesn't sound to me anything like it's spelled, but this is now, they're called the Apple of China. This company is really pushing the services that they put on their products, and they have their own browser as well. Yeah, and they're forked Android, so there's a completely different version. So it gets even worse in China. So when it comes to complexity, testing is a key factor, key thing to consider. Now, moving on to how do we pay for the internet? Well, of course, as businesses, we pay for it in lots of different forms, but as consumers, we pay through a subscription with a mobile network, whether that's pay-as-you-go or a contract or whatever it might be. So I'm taking Vodafone's figures here for pay-as-you-go, and if you're within your bundle, you're paying about a penny per megabyte. Yeah? If you're out of bundle, you'll be paying 10p a megabyte. Okay, so I'm sure the question on Paul's lips is how much would it cost me to download the Wall Street Journal's homepage? That is 30p, sir.
No, thank you.
Thank you for your help. Don't say I never give you anything. That's 30p it would have cost to load that page. Okay, it's just mad, and as Tej was saying earlier, that's led to people using ad blockers, partly because the content's advertising and they don't see value in the advertising. But actually, in the case of the Wall Street Journal, that isn't entirely true. It's just there's too much content there. It's just not appropriately presented and appropriately loaded. So Joe, right at the beginning of this afternoon, talked about accelerated mobile pages, and Google, I think, deserve a great deal of credit for shining a light on this issue. And this is a statement from when they first announced accelerated mobile pages back in October. I think it was February it became like a version 1 product. It was back in October it was first launched. Every time a web page takes too long to load, they lose a reader. They're referring to publishers and the opportunities to earn revenue. And this isn't just Google who are saying this. This is all these publishers that are saying this as well. And what they're effectively saying is all the technology that we've used to date, all the best brains in the industry, the best providers, the best tools, everything we can put together, when measured from a revenue perspective, wasn't good enough. So as a businessman, that is just an incredible admission that we now need to do more. Yeah? And the answer in accelerated mobile pages, this is a simplification, but basically is that the web server is creating 2 separate different versions of the page. It's creating one that's optimized for mobile, a very cut down version. There's different ways that can be delivered, with cached or with non-cached, and it's effectively saying as a developer, website owner, you need to create multiple versions, one for your mobile, and you can keep doing what you do today. And that makes sense. There's a lot of differences between mobile and laptop. fixed line, internet connections, radio connections. And of course, accelerated mobile pages really only works for publishers at the moment. Well, we've got to start somewhere, but if the problem statement is true for other sectors as well, it doesn't provide a solution to those sectors.
Wait a few months.
Yeah. So that's where we are with accelerated mobile pages. So shining a light on the problem. And to my mind, we now need to look sort of back to the future. Where did we come from? How did we get into this situation? And Joe mentioned this earlier, but I thought I'd give him the honour of actually including one of the papers he's written, or it's the right word, edited, chaired the construction of, for the W3C in the presentation. So this is the Mobile Web Best Practice Guide. Now, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. I haven't got like a scroll and we'll read it all together. But the basic summary is keep it simple. Yeah? Deliver lightweight, engaging content to mobile. Don't overfill the screen. Don't try and push too much. Don't try and do too much. So I'd like to think now about what is the web browser. Well, the web browser is like a little Swiss Army knife. We put it in our pocket. It does lots of different things. We can connect to different services, consume different resources, keep in touch. But in comparison to the web browser, the web server is like a massive digger. It can do certain tasks really, really well, far more effectively than a penknife can, and it's completely controlled. Yeah, not many of us probably go to data centers these days, but it's within a building you can control, or a service provider that you control, and that you have a contractual relationship with. It is a known quantity, and it's extremely powerful. So what can we do with that? Well, if we take a website, this is one we're playing with at the moment, which is our own one. We're looking at different ways of improving that, where we've got a lot of content that we want to put, or things we want to put on the home page. We're trying to sort of tease people into selecting different components of the page. We're using the full width of the screen. We're putting quotes, testimonials, links, that kind of thing. But the business purpose is really to try and see what people want to engage with and direct them to the next level of navigation. So as we put this site together, we realise certain basic things like we want to attract developers. We have through Github and services like this, a lot of good relationships with developers. But the difference between a smartphone and a desktop is that they're not going to have a need to download our API. Because no developer programs on their mobile phone, at least not yet anyway. So why have the link there? How much text do we want to put in place? We need something that's perhaps a bit shorter, less informative. We're playing with this kind of stuff from a design perspective. So what we ended up with, this again is using Perfecto to record the screen, is we took some content away. We tried to sort of leave the teasers there, but provide less for the user to have a look at. So they can still drill into certain things, but there's just not quite as much of it there, on the basis that the eye is looking at a very specific area of screen rather than sort of sitting back. What we also did is play around with some of the links. So, for example, on a mobile phone, it can make a phone call. So if your objective is to talk to people, then making it really easy for them to talk to you and making that a very prominent call to action is quite sensible. Now, for us, we're not a high volume website in the grand scheme of things, but we work with charities. Text message donation is really important to them. It's a very convenient and easy thing to do. A link that just says donate by text message now, 3 taps and you're done. Yeah, that just wouldn't work on desktop. There's no point even putting it there. So it's a very subtle difference, which when we know what the device is, we know what the device is capable of, we can introduce these kind of things. So we switched over some of the content. The other thing that sort of comes to my mind is that we've talked an awful lot as an industry over the last few years about mobile first. Yeah. Well, on laptops and desktops, which still are quite an important part of the revenue system, they're not going away. They're not going away anytime soon. We use them in parallel with our other devices. They have this thing called a pointer, which is this wonderful thing called supporting hover. So you can hover over a menu and you can reveal some stuff. In fact, e-commerce sites, particularly our customers who are in e-commerce, where they're differentiating by desktop, will make extensive use of hover to navigate multiple levels to the product that you want. And if you've got a large product catalogue, this is really important. It can get you straight down to the level you want, cross-sell the items that are going to be most likely of interest to that particular individual. So the benefits of considering the server in this equation is it can be super fast. Yeah, it's a quantity you control. It can be very quick. You can measure it. It's simple. You can actually break down some of these interconnections and say, well, actually, we will create something that supports this particular set of devices. We'll create something else that supports this set of devices. So when it comes to testing, very important thing, the testing is simply if you make a change for iPhone, you don't have to regression test it on the UC browser or whatever else it might be. And that's a huge cost for good web delivery is the testing. The server is powerful. It's the quantity you control, and ultimately that leads to improved profitability. Now, I'm very grateful for Tej again. He mentioned this word earlier, user agents. User agents are like a little fingerprint that a device sends when it communicates over the web. And it tells you, if you can interpret it correctly, just like a fingerprint, information about that device. Okay? Now, most people on the technology side of the industry, the web industry, think that user agents are evil. Okay? That one should not use user agents. And the reason they think this is because of bad experiences in the past, particularly at the beginning of the last decade. I'm talking 16 years ago, where you have things like regular expressions. These are very simple little logic programs that say, this thing says iPhone in it, so it's an iPhone. Yeah? Well, that's not true. Yeah? Most Microsoft devices now include the word iPhone in their fingerprint, predominantly to game systems like that are too simple. And they rely on large XML data files or JSON files in order to contain their data. They're community sourced, so they're not accurate. Yeah? Well, actually, if you have 20 volunteers all trying to keep a database up to date, it doesn't matter what it is, they're not going to be consistent about it. They need accuracy. And there can be excessive use of JavaScript as well to kind of add extra information to this, which of course slows the website down, a good example of over-tagging. But you all use user agents. Yeah? Google Analytics is probably the most prolific user of user agents. This is how Google Analytics tells you whether the device is a mobile, a tablet, or a desktop. Yeah, that's where that information is coming from. So they're extensively used in analytics, but why not use them to provide real-time information as well? So you can find out things like the physical screen size. That's very important for Tej in the advertising industry, so that they present appropriately sized adverts with text that you can read. You can find out things like the device price band. If you're selling mobile phones, that might be quite an interesting thing to know. What input methods are supported? I showed hover earlier. Device type classification. We obviously had 3 there, but actually you take the word mobile, that can be anything from a 7-inch device downwards. It's a very wide range of devices that are covered there, so you can go down to further detail. What type of video is supported? So you can make a macro level decision about whether you can use HLS or not for adaptive bitrate. That sort of decision can be made up front. Chipsets. For example, GPU. If your GPU is not going to support the latest video technology like H.265, then why even consider trying to send that sort of video? So with sensible use of user agents and other technologies, we can do some wonderful things that provide business value. So the algorithms that we've created are patented in the EU. We've got approval in the US just coming through now as well. And the amount of data we look at, it goes beyond these sort of basic simple solutions. We have over 434,000 different combinations of devices. We look at over 100 million different signatures of devices as well, all to turn that into something that's usable, that can immediately tell you the size of the screen, the type of device, all that kind of stuff. So that sort of information can be put into real-time decision making so that user interfaces and experiences can be optimized. And since we started 5 years ago, we've grown, and we're very pleased with just some of the businesses that are using us for all sorts of varied and different purposes, from e-commerce to gaming to brand and product promotion. So, in summary, the user interface is different by device. To try and treat the user interface exactly the same on every device, I think, does lead to mediocrity. That there are cases where that could be improved, and we've talked about that in various different forms. There's the complexity as we add ever more JavaScript, ever more technology into the same environment in this one-size-fits-all case. And when it comes to regression testing, I think that's just going to get harder and harder and harder. And ultimately, if we can simplify by going back to some of the things that were being talked about at the end of the last decade, then we can ultimately design experiences that provide more profit. Thank you very much.
Well, this is unprecedented to actually finish on time. Congratulations.
And everyone before me as well.
And indeed everybody else before you. Questions for James?
James, nobody's talked too much about tablet and what's changed or not changed, shall I say, in that area. We worked on various projects, and 2 or 3 years ago, as much as mobile was becoming, well, we've got several clients who more than half the traffic is actually mobile, inverted commas, but actually the majority of that mobile was tablet, and now it's becoming, that has shifted probably over in the last year or so. Those clients that have got quite a lot of mobile usage is heavily shifting now back over to actually a smartphone, a small screen. What do you think is happening now? What do you think going to happen there? I mean, to me it feels like people are becoming more accepting of working on a smaller screen, and the iPhone 6 and the Samsung, these phones getting slightly larger means we feel less inclined to go to our iPad. What do you think?
Well, I think, firstly, it's true from all the different sources of data that tablet browsing represents about 10% of web traffic in the UK, non-human human web traffic. 30% is crawlers, so get rid of that. So of the remaining 10% is tablets, and that's pretty stagnant. It's also made up of very old devices as well. You see products like the iPad 2, which I think is now 4.5 years old, something like that. That still represents quite a lot of tablet traffic within that category, and we know from the sales figures that the refresh rate isn't as high, so people are kind of happy with their tablets, they've found the use case, they don't feel the need to go and buy the latest and greatest one. So certainly tablets is sort of in the middle is being squeezed. So from a revenue perspective, how different is the tablet? So for your particular experiences, does the sort of 7 to 9 to 10 inch screen size, is that different to the 5 to 6 inch screen size? What are the differences between the two? Now, one really good example with tablets, where you in the advertising industry, is when you go onto a web page and you get this really little advert that appears at the bottom of the page, which looks just weird in landscape mode. And it's simply because the advertising network isn't sophisticated enough to be able to treat mobile and tablet as different things. Or the advert that's, where they can tell the difference between an 11-inch and a 6-inch screen is still quite large. So I think tablet is a niche in the middle. If you've only got, say, 5,000 visitors a month, it probably doesn't matter so much. But if you're dealing with the tens of millions, then actually 10% is still probably worth your while creating a great experience.
Over here.
Hey James, you mentioned, or we've heard a lot about sort of the Android side of things with progressive web apps and that sort of thing, and you mentioned that, I think, about 3 years ago to me and said, watch this space, apps aren't going to be the future. and looks like you might be right. So
Thank you.
I do remember you saying that. And you mentioned on your slide you had Houdini and progressive web apps, etc. You mentioned HTTP2, and that's the first time I've ever heard of HTTP2. I may be behind the times, but would you mind letting me know more about that?
Yes, I can. Does anyone know about HTTP2? Just so, okay, 3 hands, great. So basically, the way HTTP works at the moment is, let's pretend that over here on this side of the stage I'm a web browser, and the table is a web server. So what happens is the request goes over to the web server, and the request is saying, I want this particular piece of content. The web server says, okay, I'll find it, and then the request comes back into the web browser. The web browser then interprets that, and it says, I've got 50 things I now need to go and fetch. I'll try and work out which order I can fetch them in. And then it creates several versions of me, but it can't create more than 6, I think, at the moment is the number of parallel. Oh, it's 8, sorry, Joe's correcting me, 8 different requests. I think mobile browsers are less, aren't they? It does vary, yeah. You see this in the timeline thing that Alice showed earlier. It's really quite cool to look at. So you get a number of things that go off and then go request the asset, then come back again, and that happens while your page is being built up. What HTTP2 does is completely change that. So it turns these requests after the first request into effectively a series of packets. So things can be sent in parallel with each other over the same stream, effectively. So it just becomes more efficient. You don't have several different versions of me having a communication. You have just lots of things coming across in kind of one go. And what can happen is the server can do some really clever things. So it can say, you've asked for this, but I know the next thing you're going to ask for is this. And I'll start sending that to you now. I'll be able to make that decision. So what that means for web designers is if you do something like minification, so this is where you take the different assets that form your page and you bundle them all into one thing, which is quite efficient in that early request where you've got this sort of backwards and forwards. That kind of isn't needed anymore. In fact, that becomes a bad thing to do, because of course what happens is if you bundle everything together and just one thing changes, that whole bundle needs to be sent again. Whereas you don't need to do that with HTTP2. It's just a far more efficient way of communicating. Now that's like a gross oversimplification, I suppose, of what it means. But the implications are that HTTP2 requires different ways of approaching certain things that we do today. And of course there's going to be this parallel running where we've got, not everything's going to be running on HTTP2. Fast forward 10 years, I guess we could take a bet on how long it would be before enough of the web is using HTTP2 that we don't have to worry about the previous one. But there's going to be this period of parallel running. And as technologists or your colleagues who are technologists, you have to face a decision about how to approach that. But it's here today, it's quite widely supported, and it certainly shouldn't be ignored, but it's a whole kind of afternoon on its own, I think. Yeah, do look at it in more detail if you can.
More questions? I just wanted to, I'm going to amplify your response on HTTP2, because I think there's a general thought that I'd like to leave you with as a concluding remark for this afternoon. We technologists create new stuff all the time, and we heard amply about loads of new stuff that's coming along. Meanwhile, none of the old stuff ever goes away, and that is quite an interesting reflection. So let's see, who knows about the term space junk? Space junk is stuff that floats around in orbit above the Earth because previous space missions just left it there. And it may be anything from a very small piece of dust to quite a large chunk of a spacecraft. And it's all up there floating around, and it'll always be in the way forevermore. Now, when we create new technologies like HTTP2, or indeed like HTML5, or like anything else, what we're not doing is removing any of the stuff that ever came before. So the world is actually becoming progressively more complicated, and it is something that we need to think about quite carefully that the idea that you can simply make a web page is, I'm afraid, not true today and will become increasingly less true tomorrow. We will need to use more sophisticated tools to get our jobs done. We need to do a better job, and we need to use better tools. James just told us about one part of that picture. Thank you, James. Thank you, everybody. We have MOTs now, if we want. Would you like to tell us about that?
Yes, I would, I think. So MOT is a grand name for having a chat with me or my colleagues who are around the room or with each other about any aspect of what we've discussed this afternoon that you'd like to know more about. And specifically if you've got a client or yourself, you want to get sort of our thoughts on some of these things. We've got a few laptops, we can look at dev tools and things like that over a beer and discuss, basically. And we'd be very keen on your feedback, and thank you very much for attending this afternoon. I hope it's been useful.
Key word there was beer. Thank you. And see you out there for more beer. Bye.
Thank you.